My parents faked my twin brother's death to steal his trust fund, so I followed the money trail and found him living under a new identity in another state. The man at the gas station had my brother's scar. Same place, same jagged line running from his left eyebrow into his hairline, the one Ethan got when we were 7, and he fell off the monkey bars at Riverside Elementary. I was pumping gas into my Subaru in a town called Millbrook, Oregon, 300 miles from where I'd buried my twin brother 11 years ago, and this stranger was standing at pump 6 with Ethan's scar on Ethan's face with Ethan's exact posture. My hands went numb. The gas nozzle slipped from my grip, still pumping, spraying premium unleaded across my shoes and the concrete. The man looked up at the sound. Our eyes met for exactly 3 seconds, and then he was in his truck, a gray Ford F-150, peeling out of the station so fast his tires screamed. I'd been living with the grief of losing my twin for over a decade. Ethan drowned, they told me, during a fishing trip with our father in Lake Champlain when we were 19. I wasn't there. I was at college 3 states away, taking finals during my sophomore year at Boston University. The call came from my mother at 2:34 a.m. on a Saturday morning. Her voice was fractured, barely recognizable, saying the words that would hollow out my life. "Ethan's gone. There was an accident. Your father tried to save him, but he couldn't reach him in time." I flew home that same day, walked into our house where Ethan and I had shared a bedroom for 19 years, and felt the wrongness of his absence like a physical wound. The funeral happened 5 days later. Closed casket because they never found his body. My father stood at the front of the church, face gray with what I thought was grief, explaining to 300 people how the current had been too strong, how Ethan had gone under and never resurfaced. The Coast Guard searched for 4 days before calling it off. They said the lake was deep, that bodies sometimes never came up, that we should accept he was gone. I accepted it because what choice did I have? My twin, my other half, the person who knew me better than anyone, was dead at 19. I spent the next 11 years carrying that weight, learning to be singular instead of plural. But now, I was standing in a gas station in Oregon with gasoline soaking through my sneakers, and I'd just seen a ghost with my brother's scar driving away in a panic. My phone was in my hand before I consciously decided to move. I took 3 photos of the truck before it disappeared around the corner, capturing the license plate clearly in the last one. Oregon plates, number KXT892. Then I went inside, asked the clerk if the security cameras worked. She nodded, bored, and I told her I needed to speak with the manager about an incident. She shrugged and called someone named Dennis, who emerged from the back office smelling like cigarettes and looking irritated. I explained that I'd witnessed a hit and run, that the truck at Pump 6 had sideswiped my car before fleeing. Complete lie, but I needed that footage. Dennis pulled up the security system, showed me the timestamp from 15 minutes ago, and there he was on the grainy footage. The man with my brother's face, paying for gas with a credit card, his features clear enough that my stomach dropped through the floor. It was Ethan. Older, maybe 30 pounds heavier, different haircut, but unmistakably my twin. Dennis offered to email me the footage for insurance purposes. I gave him my email and left before he could ask questions I couldn't answer. I sat in my car in that gas station parking lot for 45 minutes, shaking so badly I couldn't grip the steering wheel. Ethan was alive. My brother, who I'd mourned for 11 years, was alive and living in Oregon under what had to be a false identity, which meant everything about his death was a lie. Everything my parents told me, the funeral, the grief counseling, the empty casket we'd buried in our family plot, all of it was fabricated. But why? Why would they fake their own son's death? Why would Ethan go along with it? Why would they let me believe my twin was dead for over a decade? The trust fund. The thought hit me like cold water, sudden and clarifying. Our grandfather, my mother's father, had died when Ethan and I were 16. He'd been a commercial real estate developer, wealthy in that quiet, old money way. His will left each of his grandchildren a trust fund, accessible when we turned 25. I'd received mine 6 years ago, exactly as planned. $280,000 deposited into an account with my name on it, managed by a firm called Heritage Trust Management. But Ethan had died at 19, 6 years before he could access his money. I'd never thought about it before, never questioned what happened to his portion of the inheritance. I pulled up my banking app and found the Heritage Trust contact information: a phone number, an email address, a physical location in Hartford, Connecticut. I called, was transferred 3 times, and finally reached someone named Jeffrey Carver, who identified himself as a senior trust administrator with 18 years at the firm. I explained that I was inquiring about my deceased brother's trust, that I was his twin and sole surviving sibling, and I needed to know what happened to his funds after his death. Jeffrey made sympathetic noises and put me on hold for 6 minutes. When he returned, his voice had changed from sympathetic to carefully neutral. "Mr. Holloway, I'm looking at the file now. The trust established for Ethan Holloway was dissolved in October of 2013, 6 months after his documented death. The funds were released to his legal next of kin, as specified in the trust documents. I asked who the next of kin was, though I already knew the answer. Your parents, Richard and Diane Holloway, filed the death certificate and claim paperwork. The dissolution was processed according to standard protocol. The full amount, $280,000, was transferred to an account in their names." I thanked Jeffrey, hung up, and sat staring at my phone screen until it went dark. My parents had stolen Ethan's trust fund. They'd faked his death to access money that legally belonged to him, money he would have received at 25. Which meant Ethan was complicit, or Ethan was a victim, or some combination I couldn't yet parse. I needed to find him, needed to understand what happened and why. The license plate was my starting point. I drove to the nearest library, used their public computer to access a vehicle registration database I probably shouldn't have had access to. One of my college roommates had become a private investigator, had shown me tricks during a drunken night 5 years ago. The registration came back to a Daniel Foster, age 30, address in Millbrook, Oregon. I drove to the address listed on the registration, a small craftsman-style house on the east side of town with a well-maintained yard and a wooden porch. The gray Ford F-150 was parked in the driveway. I sat in my car across the street for 2 hours, watching, waiting, trying to decide what to do with the information I'd stumbled into. At 6:15 p.m., the front door opened and Ethan walked out. Same scar, same gait, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. He got in the truck and drove away. I followed him, keeping 3 cars back, feeling like a character in a movie I didn't want to be in. During those 2 hours of waiting, I called our Aunt Linda, my mother's sister who lived in Vermont. She'd been at the funeral, had held me while I sobbed over the closed casket, had sent me care packages during my first year of college after Ethan died. If anyone would remember details about that time, it would be Linda. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice warm and surprised. "Oliver." What a lovely surprise. "How are you, honey?" I told her I needed to ask some questions about Ethan's death, that some things weren't making sense to me. Her warmth shifted immediately to concern. I asked if she remembered anything strange about the funeral arrangements, about how my parents had handled things. Linda was quiet for a long moment. "Actually, yes," she said slowly. "Your mother wouldn't let me help with any of the planning. I offered to handle the service, to coordinate with the funeral home, but she insisted on doing everything herself. She was very controlling about who could speak, what could be said, and she refused to have the casket opened, even for family. I thought at the time it was because she was protecting you, protecting all of us from seeing him after being in the water so long. But it struck me as odd that she wouldn't even let your father's brother, the one who's a pastor, say a prayer over the body before the service." More pieces clicking into place. My mother had controlled every aspect of the funeral because there was no body to see, no death to mourn. She'd stage managed the entire production, keeping anyone from getting close enough to discover the truth. I asked Linda if she remembered anything about my parents' financial situation around that time. Another pause. Well, they'd just bought that boat a few months before Ethan died. I remember thinking it was an odd purchase, given that your father had been complaining about money troubles at Christmas. And then, after the funeral, maybe 6 months later, they renovated the entire kitchen. Your mother showed me photos, all custom cabinets and granite countertops. I wondered where the money came from, but I didn't ask. It seemed inappropriate after losing Ethan. The boat. I'd forgotten about the boat. A 26-foot cabin cruiser my father had purchased in March, 2 months before Ethan's supposed drowning in May. He'd claimed it was a midlife crisis purchase, something he'd always wanted. Now I understood it was purchased with the first advance from Ethan's trust fund, money they'd already planned to steal. The boat was both cover story and trophy, a prop for the fake fishing accident and a reward for their upcoming crime. I thanked Linda, told her I'd explain everything soon, and hung up before she could ask more questions. He drove to a grocery store, went inside with a reusable shopping bag, emerged 20 minutes later with what looked like a week's worth of food. I watched him load bags into his truck bed, watched him check his phone, watched him drive back to the house I'd just left. This time, a woman came out to help him carry groceries inside. Blonde, maybe 35, laughing at something he said. They looked comfortable together, domestic, like people who'd built a life. I took photos of everything, documentation I didn't yet know what to do with. I needed help. I needed someone who could make sense of the legal and financial implications of what I was uncovering. I called my best friend from college, Amanda Reeves, who'd gone to law school and now practiced family law in Boston. I explained the situation in halting sentences that probably sounded insane. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Oliver," she said finally, using the tone she reserved for serious conversations. "What you're describing is fraud on a massive scale. If your parents falsified a death certificate to access trust funds, that's criminal. If Ethan participated knowingly, he could be charged too. You need to contact a lawyer who specializes in estate fraud, and you need to do it immediately." Amanda gave me 3 names. I called the first one, a lawyer named Raymond Cho in Portland, with 23 years specializing in trust and estate litigation. I drove 3 hours north to Portland, met him in his office at 8 a.m. the next morning. Raymond was mid-50s, silver hair, expensive suit, the kind of lawyer who inspired confidence just by existing. I laid out everything I knew, showed him the photos, the gas station footage Dennis had emailed me, the trust dissolution documents Jeffrey had sent after I'd formally requested them as a beneficiary. Raymond studied everything for 30 minutes without speaking, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. Raymond said finally, setting down his pen. Quote 11. Raymond made phone calls while I sat in his office drinking coffee that tasted like burnt regret. He contacted a forensic accountant named Julia Brenner, a private investigator named Thomas Gaines, and someone at the Oregon State Police Fraud Division. Within 3 hours, I'd been transformed from grieving brother to the center of a criminal investigation. Thomas Gaines met us at Raymond's office that afternoon, a wiry man in his late 40s with the weathered face of someone who'd spent too much time outdoors. He'd brought a laptop and a file folder thick with documentation. Quote 12. Thomas said, opening the laptop to show us his findings. Quote 13. The forensic accountant, Julia Brenner, arrived an hour later with her own laptop and a presentation that made my head spin. She'd accessed the financial records Raymond had obtained through legal channels and tracked the money from Heritage Trust Management through my parents' accounts. Quote 14. Julia explained, showing us bank statements on her screen. Quote 15. I asked what happened to the remaining $130,000. Julia clicked through more documents. Raymond leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Oliver, before we proceed, I need to know what you want out of this. Do you want criminal prosecution? Do you want the money recovered? Do you want to reconnect with your brother? Because those are 3 separate goals that might conflict with each other. If we go to the police, everyone involved will be arrested, potentially including Ethan if we can't prove he was coerced. If we approach this as a civil matter, we can recover funds, but your parents might not face jail time. You need to decide what justice looks like for you." I thought about the 11 years I'd spent grieving, the therapy sessions, the guilt I'd carried for not being there when Ethan died, the way I'd visited his empty grave every year on his birthday. I thought about my parents sitting across from me at holiday dinners, accepting my grief, lying to my face for over a decade. I thought about Ethan, living in Oregon under a false name, either trapped in a nightmare or complicit in a crime. I looked at Raymond and said, quote 19. Raymond nodded slowly. Quote 20. I spent the next 4 days writing everything I could remember. The week before Ethan's supposed death, my father had called me at school, asked me detailed questions about my finals schedule, which days I'd be unreachable. I'd thought he was being supportive, making sure I could focus on exams. Now I realized he was confirming I'd be far away and unavailable when they staged the drowning. My mother had called Ethan home from his job that same week, said there was a family emergency. Ethan had mentioned it during our last phone call, said he was heading home for a few days but would be back. That was the last time we spoke. Thomas Gaines approached Ethan on a Friday morning. I wasn't there, but he recorded the conversation with Ethan's permission after revealing his identity. Thomas played the recording for me in Raymond's office, and I heard my brother's voice for the first time in 11 years. It was deeper, rougher around the edges, but unmistakably Ethan. Quote, 21. Ethan said on the recording, his voice shaking. Quote, 22. Thomas pressed gently, mentioned the scar, mentioned our resemblance, mentioned Heritage Trust Management. There was a long pause, then Ethan's voice came back broken. How did you find me? Thomas explained that I'd seen him at the gas station, that I'd hired investigators, that the truth was coming out whether Ethan cooperated or not. Another long pause. Then, I want to talk to my brother. I want to talk to Oliver before I say anything else. If he's really behind this, if he really knows I'm alive, I need to hear it from him. Thomas looked at me after the recording ended. He wants to meet you. Tomorrow, neutral location. I'll be there as a witness. Are you ready for this? I wasn't ready. How could anyone be ready to meet a brother they'd mourned for 11 years? But I said yes anyway, and Thomas set up the meeting for 10 a.m. on Saturday at a park in Millbrook. I drove down Friday night, stayed in a motel that smelled like mildew and old cigarettes, didn't sleep at all. At 9:45 a.m., I was sitting on a bench near a duck pond, watching families feed birds and children play on swings, waiting for my dead brother to walk into my life again. He appeared at 10:03 a.m., walking slowly across the grass with Thomas beside him. He looked exactly like the man I'd seen at the gas station, but also nothing like the 19-year-old I remembered. He'd aged, obviously, but more than that, he looked tired. Tired in a way that went bone deep, a weariness that comes from carrying heavy secrets for too long. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably 30 seconds. Then Ethan said, using the nickname no one else had ever called me, and I knew with absolute certainty it was really him. We sat on the bench together, not touching, not knowing how to bridge 11 years of fake death and real grief. Thomas stood 15 feet away, giving us privacy while maintaining his role as witness. Ethan spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. I asked who were, though I already knew. Ethan closed his eyes. Quote 29. The story came out slowly, painfully, in fragments I had to piece together. Our grandfather's will had specified that the trust funds would be accessible at 25, no exceptions. Our parents were drowning in debt, had been for years, living beyond their means while maintaining the appearance of middle-class stability. They'd taken out a second mortgage, maxed out credit cards, borrowed from friends. When our grandfather died and left us each nearly $300,000, they saw a solution to their problems. But the money was locked until we turned 25, and they couldn't wait 6 years. Ethan told me about the night our parents first approached him with the plan. It was 3 weeks before the fake drowning, late April, and they'd asked him to come home from his job at the landscaping company where he worked. He'd thought someone was sick, thought there was a medical emergency. Instead, he found our parents sitting at the kitchen table with financial documents spread everywhere. Our father had a bottle of whiskey half empty in front of him, and our mother's eyes were red from crying. They told him the truth they'd been hiding for years. They owed nearly $400,000 across multiple creditors. The house was 3 months from foreclosure, and they'd borrowed money from people who weren't patient about repayment. They had a spreadsheet, Ethan said, his voice hollow with memory. Mom had made this detailed breakdown of all their debts, all the interest rates, all the payment schedules they'd missed. She showed me letters from the bank, from credit card companies, from someone named Victor, who apparently loaned Dad $60,000 for a business investment that failed. She said Victor was getting aggressive, that he'd been making threats. She cried and said she didn't know how to protect us, how to keep the family safe. Dad just sat there, looking broken, looking like he'd failed at everything. They'd presented the fake death plan as a temporary solution, a way to access Ethan's trust fund early without technically breaking the law. Our father had researched the trust documents obsessively, finding the clause about death releasing funds to next of kin. He'd even consulted with an estate attorney under false pretenses, asking hypothetical questions about trust dissolution in cases of beneficiary death. The attorney had explained the process, never suspecting our father was planning to exploit it. Our parents told Ethan he'd be dead for maybe 6 months, a year at most, just long enough to clear the debts and stabilize their finances. Then they'd all relocate somewhere together, maybe California or Arizona, and start fresh. Ethan continued, staring at his hands. Quote 34. They approached Ethan first, Ethan who was always the more trusting one, the one who wanted to please. They told him the family was facing bankruptcy, that they were about to lose the house, that collectors were calling daily. They needed his help, needed access to his trust fund early. They'd researched the trust documents and found a loophole. If a beneficiary died before age 25, the funds would be released immediately to the next of kin. They proposed that Ethan die temporarily, long enough for them to access the money, solve their financial problems, and then everyone could disappear and start over. Ethan was 19 and terrified of his family losing everything. He agreed. Our father staged the fishing accident, filed a false death report with the Coast Guard, submitted paperwork claiming they'd witnessed Ethan drown. Ethan spent 3 days hiding in our grandparents' old cabin in the woods while the fake search happened. Then our father drove him to Oregon, set him up with a contact who specialized in creating new identities, and handed him $15,000 to start his new life as Daniel Foster. He told me it would be 6 months, maybe a year, Ethan said, his voice breaking. He said once the financial situation was stable, once they'd paid off the debts, we'd all relocate somewhere together and I could come back. But 6 months became a year, then 2 years, then 5. Every time I called, they had new reasons why it wasn't safe yet, why I needed to stay hidden. I asked if he knew they'd stolen his entire trust fund, if he understood they'd kept all his money. Ethan nodded miserably. I figured it out about 3 years ago. I hired a lawyer here, had him make inquiries about the trust. When I found out they'd kept everything, that they'd lied about the debt, that they'd just wanted the money for themselves, I felt like I'd died for real, like the person I was before was actually dead, and Daniel Foster was all that was left. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw tears on his face. I wanted to tell you. Every year on our birthday, I'd write letters I never sent. I have a box full of them, 11 years of letters explaining everything. I thought about showing up at your door 100 times, but I was terrified you'd hate me for letting you believe I was dead. I wanted to hate him. Part of me did hate him, hated that he'd let our parents manipulate him, hated that he'd stayed hidden for 11 years while I grieved, but the larger part of me understood that he was a victim too, that our parents had exploited his trust and his fear and trapped him in a nightmare. I asked what he wanted to do now, whether he was willing to testify against our parents, whether he wanted to reclaim his identity. Ethan was quiet for a long time, watching the ducks on the pond. I want my life back, he said finally. I want to stop being Daniel Foster. I want Mom and Dad to face what they did. But I'm scared. I've been scared for 11 years, and I don't know how to stop. Raymond Cho filed formal complaints with the Connecticut State Police, the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, and the Oregon Attorney General's office within 48 hours of Ethan agreeing to cooperate. The evidence was overwhelming. The fraudulent death certificate, the trust dissolution documents, the money trail Julia Brenner had meticulously documented, and Ethan's testimony describing the entire scheme. On a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after I'd seen my brother at that gas station, federal agents arrested our parents at their home in Connecticut. The charges included death certificate fraud, trust fund fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and money laundering. The arrest made the local news that evening. I was in a hotel room in Portland when I saw the broadcast, watching my childhood home surrounded by federal vehicles, watching my parents being let out in handcuffs. The reporter, a young woman named Jessica Lynn standing on our front lawn, described it as one of the most elaborate trust fraud schemes Connecticut has seen in decades. She mentioned a twin brother, faked death, stolen inheritance, false identity in another state. By the next morning, the story had gone national. CNN picked it up, then NBC, then every major outlet. Parents' fake son's death to steal trust fund dominated headlines for 3 days. The media attention was overwhelming. Reporters found my phone number, called at all hours asking for interviews. They found the house I was renting in Boston, camped outside with cameras. One journalist from the New York Times tracked down my college roommate, interviewed him about what I was like during the period after Ethan's supposed death. The resulting article, published 6 days after the arrest, painted me as the unwitting victim of an elaborate con. It included quotes from my freshman year RA about how withdrawn I'd become, how I'd dropped out of social activities, how I'd needed academic accommodations for grief counseling. Reading about my own trauma in a newspaper felt surreal and violating. Ethan faced even worse media scrutiny. Reporters descended on Millbrook, interviewing neighbors who'd known him as Daniel Foster, co-workers from the construction company where he'd worked for 8 years, the owner of the coffee shop he visited every morning. The articles painted conflicting pictures. Some portrayed him as a victim of parental manipulation, a young man coerced into an impossible situation. Others questioned why he'd stayed hidden for 11 years, why he'd never tried to contact me, whether he was complicit in the fraud. One particularly nasty opinion piece in a Portland newspaper suggested he'd enjoyed the freedom of starting over, that he'd abandoned his real life voluntarily. Claire, Ethan's fiancée, who'd known him as Daniel, gave an interview to a local news station trying to defend him. She explained that she'd met a man who seemed haunted, who never talked about his past, who had nightmares he couldn't explain. She said she'd loved Daniel Foster but was learning to love Ethan Holloway, that the man was the same even if the name was different. The interview was meant to be sympathetic, but comment sections online tore her apart. People called her naive, called her an enabler, suggested she'd known about the fraud and was covering for him. She deleted all her social media accounts within 48 hours. The prosecutor's office scheduled a press conference to address the media frenzy. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Reeves, a stern man in his early 50s with 30 years in federal prosecution, stood at a podium surrounded by law enforcement officials and explained the charges in detail. He made clear that Ethan was considered a victim, not a suspect, that he'd been 19 when coerced into the scheme and had been manipulated for years afterward. "Mr. Ethan Holloway is cooperating fully with our investigation," Reeves stated, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to commanding courtrooms. "He has provided extensive testimony and documentation that forms the foundation of our case against Richard and Diane Holloway. We do not anticipate bringing charges against him." That statement helped, but it didn't stop the speculation. True crime podcasts started covering the case within 2 weeks. I listened to one episode out of morbid curiosity and immediately regretted it. The hosts, 2 women who sounded too cheerful, discussing other people's trauma, spent 90 minutes speculating about our family dynamics, about whether Ethan had been abused as a child, about whether I'd had any suspicions over the years. They read excerpts from my social media posts, analyzing photos I'd posted of Ethan's grave on his birthday, looking for hidden meanings that didn't exist. One host suggested maybe I'd subconsciously known he was alive, that grief couldn't last 11 years without some underlying doubt. I wanted to call in and scream at them, but Raymond advised against engaging with media in any form. My mother called me from jail at 3:47 p.m. that same day. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won over anger. Her voice was high and panicked, completely different from the controlled maternal tone I'd known my whole life. "Oliver, please. You have to help us. This is all a misunderstanding. We can explain everything. We did it for the family. We did it to protect you boys." I asked her how stealing Ethan's money and faking his death protected anyone. She started crying, that manipulative crying she'd always used when she wanted something. "We were desperate. We made a mistake, but we're your parents. You can't let them destroy us over one mistake." I told her that faking a child's death and stealing $300,000 wasn't one mistake. It was a series of calculated crimes that destroyed 2 lives and 11 years of trust. I told her I'd spent 11 years thinking my twin was dead, that I'd gone to therapy, that I'd visited an empty grave, that I'd carried guilt and grief that belonged entirely to her and my father. Then I hung up and blocked her number. She tried to call 16 more times that day. I blocked those numbers too. The trial happened 9 months later. The prosecution's case was airtight, built on documents and testimony that left no room for doubt. The forensic accountant Julia Brenner walked the jury through every transaction, every transfer, every attempt to hide stolen money. Thomas Gaines testified about finding Ethan in Oregon, about confirming his real identity, about the false documents our parents had used to create Daniel Foster. Raymond Cho presented the trust documents, the death certificate, the Coast Guard reports that our father had falsified, and then Ethan testified. Before Ethan took the stand, the prosecution called several witnesses I hadn't expected. The first was Lieutenant Commander David Morrison from the U.S. Coast Guard, the officer who'd overseen the search for Ethan's body 11 years ago. Morrison, now retired with 28 years of service, testified about the search protocols, about how my father had reported the drowning, about the inconsistencies in my father's statement that had bothered him at the time, but not enough to trigger an investigation. Quote 48. Morrison explained to the jury. Quote 49. The prosecution also called Dr. Eleanor Vance, a forensic document examiner with 32 years of experience, who'd analyzed the death certificate my parents submitted to Heritage Trust Management. Dr. Vance explained to the jury how she'd identified multiple irregularities in the document that suggested forgery. She testified, showing enlarged images on a screen. Quote 51. Then came Jeffrey Carver from Heritage Trust Management, looking uncomfortable in a suit that seemed too tight. The prosecution led him through his testimony carefully, establishing how the trust dissolution process normally worked, what safeguards were in place, and how my parents had exploited gaps in the verification system. Jeffrey explained, his voice apologetic. Quote 53. The prosecution called my Aunt Linda as well. She testified about the funeral, about how controlling my mother had been, about the financial inconsistencies she'd noticed. My sister bought a boat 2 months before, claiming she couldn't afford Ethan's funeral costs, Linda said, her voice sharp with anger she'd been holding for 11 years. Quote 55. Our cousin Nathan testified too, our father's nephew who'd worked in banking before retiring. Nathan had helped our parents restructure some of their debt 2 years before Ethan's fake death, had seen their financial records, knew how bad things were. Uncle Richard owed money everywhere, Nathan told the jury. He'd taken out personal loans from at least 6 different sources that I knew about. He'd borrowed against his 401k, maxed out every credit card, even taken out a payday loan at one point. When I helped him consolidate some of the debt, I calculated he needed to come up with about $400,000 to clear everything and start fresh. That number stuck with me. When I heard about the trust fund amount Ethan was supposed to receive, I realized it matched almost exactly. The prosecution built their case like a brick wall, each witness adding another layer of evidence, each document removing another avenue of doubt. They showed emails between my parents and the identity broker who'd created Daniel Foster's documentation, messages that had been recovered from my father's deleted email folders. They showed text messages between my mother and my father discussing the plan, including one chilling exchange from the week before the fake drowning. My father, quote 58, quote, my mother, quote 59, quote. They brought in a psychiatrist, Dr. Leonard Fisk, with 26 years specializing in family dynamics and coercive control, who explained to the jury how parents can manipulate adult children through emotional leverage. Quote 60. Dr. Fisk testified. Quote 61. He sat in the witness box wearing a suit I'd helped him pick out the week before, looking more like the brother I remembered than he had in months. He told the jury everything, from the initial conversation, where our parents proposed the scheme, to the 11 years he'd spent living under a false identity. He explained how they'd convinced him it was temporary, how they'd strung him along with promises that never materialized, how he'd finally realized they'd never intended to let him reclaim his real life. The jury watched him with expressions ranging from sympathy to horror, and several jurors were visibly crying by the time he finished. Our parents' defense attorney, a man named Gregory Phillips, who specialized in white-collar crime, tried to paint them as desperate people who'd made poor choices under financial pressure. He brought in a financial expert who testified about the stress of debt, about how good people could make bad decisions when facing bankruptcy. It might have worked if the evidence hadn't been so damning, if the money trail hadn't shown luxury purchases and offshore accounts, if Ethan's testimony hadn't revealed the calculated manipulation. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and came back with guilty verdicts on all counts. Sentencing happened 3 weeks later. Judge Margaret Thornton, a federal judge with 28 years on the bench, reviewed the pre-sentence reports and victim impact statements before looking at our parents with an expression of undisguised contempt. Quote, 62. She said, her voice cold and precise. Quote, 63. She sentenced our father to 12 years in federal prison and our mother to 10 years. They'd served their time in different facilities, no possibility of communication, and upon release they'd be subject to restitution requirements that would take the rest of their lives to fulfill. The court ordered them to repay the full trust fund amount plus interest, calculated by Julia Brenner at $432,000. Every asset they owned would be liquidated to start the repayment, and their wages would be garnished after release. Judge Thornton made it clear they would spend decades paying back what they'd stolen. The legal proceedings to restore Ethan's identity took another 4 months. Raymond filed petitions to void the death certificate, to restore his legal status, to reclaim his social security number and birth certificate. It was complicated by the fact that Daniel Foster had built a legitimate life, had a credit history and employment records and relationships. The court had to carefully unwind one identity while rebuilding the other. Eventually, the Oregon court ruled that Ethan Holloway had never legally died, that Daniel Foster was a fraudulent identity, and that Ethan could reclaim his original name and legal status. Heritage Trust Management, facing potential liability for releasing the funds without proper verification of death, agreed to restore Ethan's trust fund in full, including 11 years of accumulated interest. The final amount came to $391,000, deposited into an account bearing his real name. It wasn't everything he'd lost, couldn't replace the years he'd lived in hiding, but it was something. It was acknowledgement that what happened to him was wrong, that he deserved what our grandfather had intended him to have. We spent 6 months rebuilding our relationship, learning to be brothers again after 11 years apart. We looked identical in ways that went beyond appearance, the mirror twin connection we'd always had reasserting itself in strange moments. We'd start sentences the same way, laugh at the same jokes, finish each other's thoughts like no time had passed. But we were also different now, shaped by separate experiences and separate griefs. Ethan had trauma from living in hiding, from constantly looking over his shoulder, from building a life on a foundation of lies. I had trauma from grieving someone who wasn't dead, from being lied to by the people who were supposed to protect me, from 11 years of absence that couldn't be recovered. The woman I'd seen helping Ethan with groceries was named Claire Donovan, a nurse he'd met 4 years ago who knew him as Daniel Foster. Telling her the truth was one of the hardest things Ethan did during the whole process. She'd built a relationship with someone who didn't technically exist, had fallen in love with a fabrication. When Ethan explained everything, showed her the legal documents, introduced her to me, she went through her own grieving process. She grieved Daniel Foster, the man she'd known, even though that man was standing right in front of her with a different name. Eventually, she decided to stay, to build something new with Ethan Holloway. They got married 8 months after his identity was legally restored. I was the best man at their wedding, standing next to my brother in matching suits, watching him marry someone who'd chosen to love him despite everything. During my toast, I talked about second chances, about finding people who see you clearly even when everything else is broken. I didn't mention our parents. They were gone, locked away in federal prisons on opposite sides of the country, and neither of us had visited or planned to. Some bridges don't just burn, they collapse entirely, and trying to rebuild them only wastes time better spent moving forward. It's been 18 months since I saw Ethan at that gas station. We talk every week, visit each other every few months, trying to recover some of what was stolen from us. It's not the same as growing up together, not the same as sharing those 11 years we lost. But it's something. It's a relationship built on truth instead of lies, on choice instead of obligation. We're twins again, not identical in experience, but connected in ways that go deeper than shared DNA. Sometimes I think about the alternate timeline, the one where I never stopped for gas in Millbrook, where I never saw the man with my brother's scar. In that timeline, I'd still be visiting an empty grave every year, still carrying grief that didn't belong to me, still believing the lie my parents constructed. In that timeline, Ethan would still be Daniel Foster, still hiding, still living a half-life built on fraud. I'm grateful for the gas station, for the chance encounter that blew apart everything I thought I knew. The truth destroyed my family, but it gave me back my brother. That trade, as painful as it was, feels worth it. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.